My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
Pronoun case and its challenges. This is the second of two videos about case in English. This one is going to be about specific areas where writers find it challenging to know which case to use. It's really not a descriptive phenomenon so much as a prescriptive phenomenon. In previous videos, I've talked about the difference between descriptive grammar and prescriptive grammar. This is very much about prescriptivism, and I think it's worth getting into it because this is an area where readers will often judge writers based on the choices that they make. In the previous video, I went over this chart, getting our terminology. So the first column, the subjective column, that's for pronouns that are the subject of a verb or a clause. And the objective is for objects of verbs or prepositions. We're really not going to be worried about possessives in this video. So I want to begin with a sort of a funny question, but when you're called on the phone and the caller says, "Is so-and-so there?" So in my case, they would say, "Is Randall Eggert there?" My question is, how do you answer? In other words, do you say, "This is him," or "This is her"? Or do you say, "This is he," or "This is she"? I say "this is he." And the reason I say "this is he" is because it was drilled into my head when I was a child that that's how you responded to that question when asked on a phone. But it does seem sort of weird. It's counterintuitive, and I would argue that it's really descriptively odd. It doesn't fit normal grammar of English. And so I think a good question is, why do we say "this is she" or "this is he"? Well, what it comes down to is logic, and I would argue faulty logic, on the part of prescriptive grammarians. What they argue is that at least some uses of be are the same as an equal sign. They call this an equative be. And if we look at this from a mathematical point, if two things are connected with an equal sign, that means that they should be parallel. That means that neither is higher than the other, and they should be treated the same way. That's the logic. And that explains, for example, when people want to be very formal with their language, like, for example, in a press conference. Imagine a press conference where there's just been a national emergency, and a politician stands up in front of a crowd and says something like this: "The police and the firefighters are the real heroes. It is they who deserve your applause." Now, I think descriptively most of us would opt for "it is them who deserve your applause." But the politicians will usually say "it is they" because it sounds more formal, and it follows that equative be logic. It is our actual subject here, but the sort of notional subject is they. And so in that sense, they argue that it should be they instead of them. Now, as I was just saying, I think that's somewhat faulty logic. So I want you to think about this. Let's say that you're at a party. So you understand that somebody's been talking about you, and you say to your friend, "Who was talking about me?" And they'll point to somebody across the room, and they'll say, he, or would they say him? Well, grammarians would argue that you should say he because it's short for saying he was talking about you. And sometimes we may just say he was. But I think in that situation, the more common thing to do would be to point to the person and say him, or it was him, right? And what I would argue is that in English, there's two things going on here. One is that the objective form of pronouns is the default. That's the unmarked case. And so when a pronoun stands all by itself, we don't say he, we don't say I, we don't say she. We would say him, we would say me, we would say them, right? And that, I think, is significant. German, it's actually the different. The default there is to use the nominative. But English has its own grammar, and that's the grammar of English. The other thing I would argue is going on here is that it actually is acting as the object, that it is the object of the verb is. So what this is actually short for isn't he was talking about me, but it was him who was talking about you. And that brings me to another example I want to give. Imagine that you're showing your kindergarten class picture. This isn't actually mine. This is one I randomly pulled up using Google. But if somebody wanted to know which one is you, you would probably point to yourself and say, that's me. I think it would be very, very odd in that situation to say, that's I. Even the most prescriptive people I know would not say that's I in that situation, even though they may answer, this is she on the telephone, or it is they who deserve your applause. So I would argue that this whole equative be argument is silly. But to some degree, we're stuck with it because some self-proclaimed experts decided that's the way it should be, and they had the power to enforce it on the language. That's the way prescriptive grammar works. Another bugaboo for this is with conjoined pronouns. This is another area where, as a descriptive linguist, I would argue that this is a perfectly natural thing for speakers of English to say. I used to say this when I was a kid because my best friend was Dan. And I would say, Mom, Dan and me are going to the park, okay? But of course, my mom, being a prescriptivist, would get upset with me and tell me that I should have said Dan and I are going to the park, okay? Now, I won't go into the details of why, as a linguist, I think it's natural to say Dan and me. I will just point out that this has been drilled into our heads, that in a situation like this, you are supposed to say Dan and I. And this leads to overgeneralization. Now, the logic of why we are supposed to say Dan and I are going to the park is because if we just had one pronoun there, like say we, it would be we are going to the park, okay? And very few people would say us are going to the park, okay? That isn't descriptively normal in most dialects of English. But that hammering in that you should say Dan and I, Dan and I, Dan and I, leads to overgeneralization. And what happens is that you get then situations like this one, where you come home and you say, Mom, the teacher chose Dan and I, which is wrong. It should be the teacher chose Dan and me. But the reason that we say that, and I actually hear very educated people saying things like the teacher chose Dan and I, or different varieties of that. And the reason is because they overgeneralized. They didn't internalize that rule that the reason that we say Dan and I are going to the park is because you would say we are going to the park. They just internalized the rule that whenever you say and plus the first person, put in I instead of me. The logic here is the teacher chose us, and therefore you should say the teacher chose Dan and me. Another thing that I often hear very educated people saying is between you and I. In fact, I would bet you that if you pay really close attention in your college classes, you will catch every semester at least one professor saying between you and I. But it's wrong. You should say between you and me because you would say between us. But again, it gets to that overgeneralization, of misunderstanding the principle and just internalizing, okay, whenever I think I'm supposed to say and me, say and I. Another one that is very challenging is challenging for two reasons. One is that whom as a form is falling out of use. In modern spoken English, very few people still use whom consistently. It's probably more common in written English, but even there you see it falling out of use to some degree. So I want to think about some examples, like, who are you going to call? Now, if we were to be prescriptive about it, that's absolutely wrong. You were supposed to say, whom are you going to call? Of course, that sounds weird and that would be a terrible song, but that would be the correct way to use whom. And the reason is because the pronoun whom is acting as the object of call. And that's the second reason why whom is hard to know how to use, is because it's in the wrong place for normal sort of canonical word order of English, which has the subject at the beginning of the sentence and the object at the end of the sentence. But with interrogatives, we move that WH word, whom, up to the beginning of the sentence, and so it's not coming after the verb, making it a little bit harder in our heads to realize that we should add that M to it, that it should be in the objective form. Now, the truth is, we're perfectly fine at doing that kind of calculation. We're speakers of English, we can handle it, and for thousands of years, English speakers did handle that. It's just a more recent phenomenon that has fallen out of use, and so we're just not in the habit of making that calculation on the fly. One way of solving the issue is to answer the question. Say, I am going to call them, and notice that them is in the objective form, and so it should be whom. And when we write, we have that luxury of being able to think it through. I don't think that I'm capable of using whom consistently in spoken English because I'm not in that practice. I understand how it works, but when you're speaking, you just don't have that luxury of time to be able to consciously think it through. We do have that luxury when we're writing. Now notice in another sentence, like who is going to call the Ghostbusters, the answer to that one is I am going to call the Ghostbusters. So here it absolutely should be who, not whom. Whom would just be wrong. And then also, if you've got some sort of preposition, as in, for whom does the bell toll? Well, that for tells us that it should be whom, because now it's the object of a preposition. Now, you could also get, whom does the bell toll for? And in that case, again, it's not coming immediately after the preposition. Makes it a little bit more challenging, but we can still do it. We can still figure these things out. And again, one way of doing it is to just say it as an answer. It tolls for thee. And then, of course, you have to know that thee is the objective form of thou. Now, who and whom are not always used in questions. They're also used in relative clauses. So let's think about this. The girl whom my son likes is over there. So the verb that we're interested in is likes. So the question is, what is the subject of like? Well, in this case, it's my son, right? It's the one who, my son is the one who likes somebody, namely the girl. And we could separate that relative clause out and make it a separate sentence. My son likes her. So in that case, it's her, objective, so it should be whom. On the other hand, it could be the girl who does the liking. So the girl who likes my son is over there. Again, our verb is likes. But now that who is acting as the subject of it, And we would get something like, she likes my son, she being subjective, therefore it should be who. Another one that is somewhat of a bugaboo, and this is one of those prescriptive rules where, in my experience, if you actually follow it, many readers will think that you're making a mistake. I've had very highly educated friends who proofread works of mine, and I followed this rule, and they thought that I had made a typo. So the logic goes like this, that when you've got a comparative, as in Gertrude beats the bass drum as much as he, then that as much as he is short for as much as he beats the bass drum. So we've got Gertrude beats the bass drum as much as he beats the bass drum. And we could put an auxiliary verb after he there, like Gertrude beats the bass drum as much as he does. Okay, now that one licenses the he. Now I would say descriptively, most people would much prefer just saying Gertrude beats the bass drum as much as him in that same exact situation. However, a prescriptivist would tell us that if we have him at the end of it, that means something radically different. What that means is that Gertrude beats the bass drum as much as she beats him. Which is an odd interpretation, perhaps, of the sentence, but that's what prescriptivists would say that you are saying. Now, do you need to pay attention to this one? I don't know. You choose. Again, if you follow it consistently, there will be some readers who are going to be really impressed by you and say, wow, that person really knows their way around language. And then there's going to be a large number of readers who are going to think, oh, that's weird. Why did they put he in that position? You choose.